the ally from across the ocean. Why the Sherman isn't what you think it is. Picture this. The fall of 1942. Stalingrad is engulfed in the fire of a colossal battle. The outcome of the entire war hangs in the balance. And into this hell, via the frigid northern seas, begin to arrive cargo ships carrying a payload that would spark debates for decades to come. This wasn't just steel and guns. It was hope. It was aid. And for some, it would become a subject of fierce controversy. The American medium tank M4, the Sherman, or as Soviet soldiers affectionately and respectfully nicknamed it, the MK from M4. From the very start, the Sherman was shrouded in a cloud of legends, myths, and outright tall tales. Untangling them is like trying to solve a complex mystery. Some claim it was a savior, a technological marvel that outclassed the Soviet T-34. Others sneer, calling it a brotherly grave for six or a Zippo lighter, praised only for its comfort. So what's the truth? The truth, as it often is, isn't black and white. It's gray, like the color of its armor, and as complicated as this machine's fate on Russian soil. Today, we're not just going to list dry facts. We're going to live the story of the MK, from its first effective engines to the victory salutes in Berlin. We'll see it through the eyes of Soviet tankers who, without knowing the word ergonomics, simply appreciated its roomy turret. We'll look at the lost reports and ask the tough question. Did these thousands of machines truly play a decisive role? Or were they just a useful, but not critical, supplement? Strap in. Our journey through time starts now. And we begin with the biggest myth of all, the enormous and daunting question about Lend-Lease. The second front, made of steel. The economics of victory and the bitter truth about aid. Before we talk tanks, let's put on our economist hats for a second. War isn't just about valor and attacks. It's a giant, ravenous machine that devours resources. Steel, aluminum, machine tools, explosives, food, boots, wiring, the list is endless. By the end of 1942, the Soviet Union was in the grips of a monstrous crisis. It had lost huge industrial and agricultural regions in Ukraine and the Donbass. Factories miraculously evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains were only just starting production, working tirelessly, often out in the open. There was a shortage of everything. Absolutely everything. And here, we need to put all politics aside and look at the numbers. The American Lend-Lease program wasn't charity. It was a cold, strategic calculation. But for the USSR, it was a lifeline. Vehicles, over 450,000 trucks, Studebakers, Fords, Dodges were delivered. Imagine what that meant for the mobility of the Red Army. The entire famous Katyusha rocket launcher on a Studebaker chassis is a symbol of that aid. Explosives and gunpowder. Nearly 1/3 of all explosives used by Soviet industry during the war were imported. Aluminum. Without American supplies of this strategic metal, aircraft production rates would have plummeted. Food. Canned meat, powdered eggs, lard, the famous second front. Millions of soldier rations. So, where did the M4A2 tank fit into this gigantic system? This is where it gets fascinating. If you look at the percentages of total Soviet production, the figures don't seem impressive. Over the entire war, the USSR produced more than 110,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. About 12,000 Shermans of various models were supplied via Lend-Lease. Over 4,000 of them M4A2. That's just over 10%. See, a skeptic will exclaim, a drop in the bucket. But let's not be hasty. War isn't linear statistics. It's about focal, concentrated application of force at decisive moments. And this is where the MK enters the stage. The missed call. Why there were no Shermans at the Battle of Kursk. Here it is, the most painful and intriguing question. The year is 1943. The Battle of Kursk. The greatest tank engagement in history. Where were the Shermans? Why didn't they see mass participation in the battle that decided the war's outcome? The answer is a detective story with elements of politics and logistics. The first M4A2S arrived in the USSR back in November of 1942, but their combat debut was delayed by a full 6 months. Why? The first reason, teething problems. Picture this. The tanks arrive in Gorky. They are being prepared for shipment to the front. And then, breakdown. Literally, the GM 6046 engines, a pair of diesels, started failing after just 5 to 10 hours of operation. Defective fuel injectors, oil leaks, issues with radiators. The quality of the first batches was, to put it mildly, not great. The Americans, it turned out, were cutting corners in their rush for quantity. Parts were hand-fitted, there was corrosion on spare components, and the tanks often arrived incomplete, sometimes even missing basic tools. In the spring of 1943, an American delegation, led by Lieutenant Colonel Gray, came to Gorky. He saw firsthand the awful state the parts arrived in. A huge scandal erupted. While the investigations dragged on, the tanks sat idle. The Soviets weren't about to send non-combat ready machines to the front. The second reason, the African appetite. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Allies were fighting their own battles. The surrender of the Italo-German forces in North Africa in May of 1943 meant the British and Americans were urgently re-equipping their units. They were mass transitioning from outdated Valentines and Matildas to new Shermans. And these Shermans were going to them first. The peak of these shipments happened to be in May-July of 1943. By a cruel twist of fate, this was exactly when the flow of M4A2S to the USSR virtually dried up. The result? In the entire gigantic Battle of Kursk, only 2 units equipped with M4A2S saw action: the 229th Tank Regiment and the 70th Tank Brigade. Their use was episodic. The 209 tanks that had arrived by then couldn't influence the course of the battle. They were a drop in the ocean of the steel avalanches that clashed at Prokhorovka. The paradox is this. The tank that was desperately needed in 1943 appeared on the front en masse only when the most acute need for it had already passed. A view from the turret. The pros and cons of the MK, and censored. Now, let's forget about numbers and strategy for a moment. Let's climb inside. What did a Soviet tanker feel when he switched from his native T-34 to this exotic overseas import? What was shockingly good? Space. This was the first thing everyone noted. The diameter of the Sherman's turret ring was a record for its time, 1,750 millimeters, compared to the cramped turret of the T-34, where the commander was also the loader and sometimes the gunner. The MK felt like a palace. The crew didn't elbow each other and could move around relatively freely. Hydraulic turret traverse. A light movement of the handle, and the multi-ton turret would turn smoothly and silently. After the hellish physical labor of the manual traverse on the T-34, this felt like magic. The speed and accuracy of aiming increased dramatically. Gun stabilizer. Yes, it was imperfect on early models, but it was a first step toward being able to fire on the move. For Soviet tankers used to having to stop to shoot, this was a miracle. Radio. Every Sherman had one, not just the command tanks, as was often the case in the Red Army. This radically improved battlefield coordination. Ergonomics. Thought-out vision devices on later models. Comfortable seats, a separate commander's cupola. All this reduced crew fatigue and increased their combat effectiveness. What was disappointing and dangerous? High silhouette. The Sherman was a tall tank. It was a whole 20 centimeters taller than it needed to be due to a design flaw. The engineers had forgotten about the drive shaft running from the engine to the transmission, requiring space under the fighting compartment. A high profile made it a better target for enemy gunners. Wobbly tooth. The center of gravity was high. The tank was prone to tipping over on slopes, during unloading from rail cars, and on rough terrain. In the memoirs of tanker Dmitry Loza, it's described how his brigade managed to tip almost half of their Shermans on their sides during unloading. This was a serious issue. Narrow tracks and poor ground pressure. The ground pressure of the Sherman was higher than that of the T-34. In the soggy Russian mud, dirt, and snow, it performed worse. The tracks would get clogged, and traction was poor. The Americans knew this and developed wider tracks, but they were almost never supplied to the USSR. A death trap, the turret basket. On one hand, it rotated with the turret, and all the shells were within reach. On the other, in case of a fire or emergency evacuation, it became a terrible trap, preventing the crew from quickly escaping the burning vehicle. Many tankers died because they couldn't get out of this steel cage. Questionable refinements. Anti-aircraft machine gun. To fire it, the commander had to be exposed from the waist up, which was suicidal. And its design made it impractical for engaging ground targets. Soldiers often just removed it. Driver and assistant driver hatches. Initially, they were small and awkward. The locking mechanism was such that on a bump, they could slam shut and cause a serious injury. The verdict? The Sherman was a tank of comfort and technology, but not always a tank of survival in the harsh Russian conditions. It required a different approach, different tactics. And Soviet tankers quickly learned this. Firepower. What the MK shot, and how it fought cats and tigers. Armament is a tank's main argument in a fight. And here, the M4A2 had an interesting evolution. Early M4A2, the 75mm M3 gun. This was an excellent, balanced weapon. Its high explosive shell was more powerful than the Soviet F-34s. But the main thing was its armor-piercing shell. It could penetrate about 80 millimeters of armor from a range of 500 meters. This meant it could successfully hit a Tiger side armor. Of course, it couldn't penetrate the 100mm front plate, but for late 1943 to early 1944, it was a formidable weapon against Panzer IVs and 3s. Late M4A2 76W, the long-barreled 76mm M1 gun. This gun appeared late in the war. In terms of armor penetration, it was comparable to, and in some areas superior to, the Soviet 85mm S-53 gun on the T-34-85. It could now engage Panthers and Tigers at longer ranges. But it had a huge flaw that is often kept quiet. The main secret of the 76mm M1 gun, its weak, high-explosive shell. War isn't just tank duels. It's mostly about destroying infantry, machine gun nests, pillboxes, and artillery positions. Here, the high explosive effect of a shell was critically important. The American 76mm gun's shell had a very weak effect due to its thick walls and small explosive charge. The shell was optimized for armor piercing. In the Pacific, American crews disliked these tanks for precisely this reason. They more often had to fight infantry, not tanks. Soviet tankers complained about this less because they always had the T-34-85 with its excellent high-explosive shell nearby. But the fact remains, the Sherman with the 76mm gun was a specialized tank destroyer, not a universal soldier like its little brother with the 75mm gun. The price of quality. Reliability that had to be field-fixed. We've already touched on quality issues, but this topic deserves its own deep dive. The myth that in the West, everything was made perfectly while we did things sloppily is shattered by harsh archival documents. Here are just a few gems from official letters and reports. A letter from Major General John Dean, dated January 13, 1944. This letter is a true indictment. It lists mass defects. Incorrect installation of the turret ring. Imagine, you're in a battle, and the turret won't turn or jams. That's death. Leaking radiators. Poor soldering quality. Defects in road wheel bearings, and broken suspension springs. The suspension was failing prematurely. Loosening of the drive sprocket ring gear mounts. Potential defects in the final drives. This is a critical failure requiring complex repairs. The track problem. The final M4A2E8 models, which were supposed to be the pinnacle of evolution, arrived with T-66 tracks that would break after just 320 kilometers of travel. Soviet repairmen had to rebuild the tracks on 177 tanks right before the Berlin operation. Road wheel wear. When using all-steel tracks, which were often sent to the USSR, the rubber chevrons on the road wheels wore out at a catastrophic rate. In the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps alone, 300 road wheels were replaced during combat operations. What does this mean? It means there was no golden standard of quality. The war dictated its rules to everyone. American factories, just like Soviet ones, worked to the point of exhaustion, hired unskilled workers, including women, as seen in Fisher Body's own promotional materials and simplified technologies. The result was predictable. The Sherman's reliability wasn't a given. It was the result of the titanic work of our American engineers, who gradually, from batch to batch, corrected the mistakes. And it was the work of Soviet repairmen who finished the overseas tech in field conditions. The bottom line. So who were you? EMCA? Hero, supporting actor, or victim of propaganda? Let's draw the line. Who was the medium tank M4A2 for the Red Army? A useful and quality second stringer. It wasn't a wonder weapon. It wasn't overall better than the T-34-85. It had its own strengths and weaknesses, but it was good enough. Reliable enough after its teething problems were fixed, powerful enough, and mobile enough. It became a reliable and faithful helper in the final, victorious stage of the war. The most numerous foreign tank. Over 4,000 M4A2s. This was the most numerous foreign tank in the Red Army. It fought in Belarus, Poland, East Prussia, and stormed Berlin. Its contribution to victory is real and measurable in the thousands of lost and replaced vehicles. A symbol of the coalition, the EMCA was living proof that the USSR was not alone in its struggle. It was the material embodiment of the Second Front, even if not as massive as one might have wished. It showed the soldier that there were allies across the ocean helping in any way they could. A victim of myths. It was either unfairly maligned, blaming it for all sins, that it burned like a match. Myth is associated with gasoline models, while the USSR received diesel M4A2s, or elevated to the heavens. The truth, as always, is in the middle. The story of a Sherman in the Red Army isn't a story about which was better. It's a story of how two different engineering schools, two different philosophies, met in the crucible of the most terrible war. The Soviet one, simple, hardy, reparable to the point of primitivism. The American one, technological, comfortable, but sometimes overly complex and not always adapted to their realities. The EMCA didn't win the war, but it helped win it. It saved the lives of thousands of Soviet tankers who fought skillfully and bravely in it. And that is its greatest merit. It traveled a long road from being defective iron in warehouses in Gorky to becoming dusty, shrapnel-riddled machines on the streets of Berlin. And that journey deserves respect and remembrance. Well, that wraps up our investigation. I hope you found it as gripping as I did. History is a living thing, and there's always room for discussion. What do you think about the Sherman's role? Did your grandfather or great-grandfather fight in an EMCA? Share your stories and opinions in the comments below. It's crucial for keeping this memory alive. And of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dives into other legends of military technology. Until next time.